We're jumping now from the Bible to the last great figure of pagan antiquity, the last great mind of the pagan world, the last great mind not to be influenced in a deep way by Judaism or Christianity. His name is Plotinus. He was born somewhere early in the 3rd century A.D., died in 270 A.D. He spoke Greek, but grew up in Egypt, part of the eastern part of the Roman Empire where they spoke Greek, but ended up doing most of his work in Rome. So he's working after the time of the New Testament, but he's not been substantially influenced by Christian or Jewish thought. You can think of him as the great articulator of Platonic spirituality. And this spirituality has become the backbone of many later forms of spirituality, especially in Christianity. He's one of the most interesting figures of the ancient world that way because his major legacy was in the Christian tradition. He founded what has been called the Neo Platonist tradition. He locates himself in the Platonic tradition, but he's doing something new. Or is he? What he's doing is systematizing the whole legacy of ancient philosophy, especially the Platonic tradition, but he also borrows a lot from Aristotle. He borrows a lot from the Stoics. But overall, it's a Platonic form of philosophy that presents a kind of classic form of Platonic spirituality. Almost all of the individual pieces of Plotinus's philosophy come from the tradition of the pagan philosophical past, but he puts them together in a package that had never been so coherent and systematic before. And his main influence is on Christian spirituality, on people like Augustine, and on the mystics of the Middle Ages. Now, to get into Plotinus, let's look at something that we've seen in Plato. Let's look at this metaphor of seeing with the mind's eye, or intellectual vision. This is the fundamental activity of all being for Plotinus. In fact, all being really is intellectual vision or contemplation for Plotinus. That's the secret of being. So being is seeing, being is knowing. Being and knowing are intrinsically linked. And the higher up you are on the scale of being, the more you know. Now, this central activity is this intellectual vision, this seeing with the mind's eye. You can think of it as thinking. It's sometimes translated that way, but that's a little bit misleading because it's less like thinking than it is like seeing. It's something that happens in one moment. It's not like talking things through, or arguing, or figuring something out, or devising a proof. It's not discursive, as the technical term goes, but intuitive. Intuitive comes from a word intuition or intuitus in Latin, meaning to behold, to see. Right? Think of this perfect moment of vision, of seeing. One way to think about it would be to put yourself back in that math class that we've talked about several times in connection with Plato. Here you are thinking about the triangle on the chalkboard, and the professor's giving you the proof. And you're working through the proof, you're trying to figure it out, but you don't quite get it yet. You're thinking it through. This is called discursive reasoning. But then comes the moment when all of a sudden it all clicks, right? And you say, aha, now I see it. Light bulb goes on in your head. Plato compared it with a fire suddenly kindling, like poof, all of a sudden there's flame. All of a sudden there's light, right? The moment of vision. Aha, I see it now. Now I get it. That is intellectual vision. It's surrounded by this process of figuring things out, but it doesn't consist in figuring things out. It consists in seeing it, getting it, right? For a Platonist, that moment when you say, aha, now I see it, is the moment when time touches eternity. The moment when a finite human mind is caught up in this world, grasps something about the timeless world of Platonic forms. And now, imagine a mind that is always like that. A mind that grasps these timeless truths and never has to figure it out, but simply sees them. Its whole being consists in seeing the whole world of Platonic forms and grasping all of these mathematical truths, right? Its whole eternal being is, aha, I see it all, right? That's what Plotinus calls the divine mind, or the divine intellect. We can call it the mind of God, if you want. That's what Christian thinkers like Augustine called it, right? You just see. You are that mind whose whole eternal being is simply this eternal gazing at eternal forms. No process of figuring it out, no effort of following a train of thought, just vision, just seeing. That's what Plotinus calls the divine mind, or intellect is probably a better translation because the activity of this is intellectual activity. The word in Greek is nous, N-O-U-S. It's been translated intellect, mind, also been translated intelligence, understanding. Understanding's a good translation, as when you understand mathematics instead of just figuring it out. You understand. It's even been translated spirit sometimes, because it's got this spiritual aspect. It's non-material, right? The mind that sees the forms has been pulled away from bodily things. It's not contemplating a chalk triangle. It's free from desire, at least bodily desire. It's free from bodily pain. It's just this eternal moment of eternal joy of contemplating and grasping, right? Because that aha moment is a moment of joy, right? It's a moment of intellectual excitement. So the divine mind is always eternally enjoying this blessed moment of contemplation, this aha, right? Imagine that as an eternal moment, and that's the divine mind. The intellect, the understanding, even the spirit. So the activity of this divine mind has been translated understanding, intellection, intelligizing. Very commonly it's been called thinking, which is, again, misleading. Don't think of figuring stuff out, but think of seeing. It can also be described as contemplation, which comes from a Latin phrase meaning to see. It's been described as intuition, again from another Latin phrase meaning to see or behold. And so now, at this point, let me back up a second. We've got the intellect, and then we've got what the intellect does, this intelligizing or understanding or seeing. And now we have to look at what the object of this seeing is. What is it that the intellect sees? It's always Platonic forms. Always some eternal, unchanging truth about reality. It sees eternal beauty, eternal virtue, eternal justice, and all those eternal mathematical truths, too. And the overarching label for these objects of intellectual vision is intelligible things. Right? Just as sensible things are things you perceive with the senses, intelligible things are things perceived by the intellect. And I've already mentioned, when this notion gets into the Christian tradition, especially through Augustine, Plotinus' concept of intellect, or the divine mind, will be identified with the mind of God. It will mean, for Augustine, that God's mind is stocked with forms that operate as blueprints for the world, right? Blueprints by which God creates the world. Blueprints is actually a good metaphor, because God is like the artist who creates the world using this form in his mind, and forms of triangles, forms of horses, forms of virtues. Now, in addition to the one intellect, the divine mind, there are many intellects, plural, small I. Our intellects, right, the highest part of our minds. We have minds that can do lots of other things besides intellectual activity, but the highest activity of our minds is intellectual. We, too, can see these eternal divine forms. And when we do, we are united with the divine intellect. Because, and here comes a really key notion, when we see a form for Plotinus, we become identical with it. Intellectual vision is ultimately a form of identity. The intellect and the form it sees become one and the same thing. So when we perceive a Platonic form, when we say, aha, I see it, our minds are being united with it. And thus our minds are becoming one with the divine mind, the divine intellect. Right? We are participating in that eternal aha, which is eternal joy, the perfect possession of all the intelligible truths, and we are lifted up into that when we ourselves perceive an eternal truth. Right? That's a divine moment. That's a participation in divine intelligence. Right? That's what it is. And that's why it's so wonderful when you have that aha experience. That's your divine moment. Your disembodied, fleshless, spiritual moment. Right? This is a kind of otherworldly piety, but there's a real attraction to it too. This is a form of tranquil, perfect, eternal joy. Right? Now, In this notion of intellectual vision, three strands of the Greek philosophical tradition come together. First, there's that notion in Plato that we noticed in the Phaedo of a fundamental kinship between the soul and the forms. Right? The soul's home is with the forms, not down here among bodies. Right? So that aha moment is a moment of going back home. This is where we belong. Right? This is not something alien to the soul. This is the soul's highest and most fundamental function. Then, secondly, there's that that metaphor of seeing, right? Seeing with the mind's eye, not the eye of the body. That's a pretty familiar metaphor by now. And thirdly, there's the notion that we become identical with the forms that we contemplate, and that comes from Aristotle. It's interesting that this very important notion in Plotinus is an Aristotelian notion. This notion that the mind becomes identical with the forms that it contemplates. Plotinus is taking this notion out of context and not doing quite the same thing with it that Aristotle does. But it is an Aristotelian notion and becomes absolutely central to the architecture of Plotinus' universe. Because Plotinus' universe is built around variations on the theme of identity and unity. So let's take a look at that now. The theme of identity and unity. For Plotinus, there's a unity that goes even deeper than intellectual vision, and that becomes crucial for the architecture of his universe. Let's start with the theme of unity in Plato. For Plato, the many has to have its source in the one. Remember, in Plato there's this one-many relationship. The many acts of virtue, or say of a particular virtue like courage, all have in common the fact that they participate in the one form of courage. And all the virtues share in the one form of virtue. And everything that's good somehow shares in the one form of the good. So the many, the multitude of changing things in our world, are governed and formed and ordered by a one. So that one-many relationship is crucial for Plotinus as it is for Plato. That means, you see, of course, that the origin of all those forms must be a one, not a many. There are many forms, so they too must have a one that governs them all. And that one is called, by Plotinus, the one, capital O, right? Sort of like intellect, capital I, for the divine mind. This one is what Plotinus will call, following Plato, a first principle. That means a source. When you think of the one, perhaps the simplest and best metaphor is to think of a geometrical point with a circle around it. A point has no structure. It is utterly one. You can't possibly break it into parts, right? But from that point, there radiates all the rest of the geometrical forms. In particular, a circle, right? A circle is defined by its relationship to the center. So think of the circle as the world of forms, containing all this multiplicity of forms, right? You can break a circle into parts. But the point at the center, which defines the circle, you can't break into parts. So that unbreakable, simple unity is the source of the manifold multiplicity of the world of forms. Right? If you think that geometrical metaphor through, you'll begin to see why for Plotinus, oneness, simplicity, this inability to break apart into parts is what makes something great. Plotinus will play on the notion of greatness here. Right? The point is not great in extent, but after all, if you're great in extent, that means you can fall apart. Right? To be great in extent is to be further from unity. True unity does not have extent, stretched outness. Right? It can't break out into parts. Now, the one, in addition to being this simple unity, is also above the forms, metaphysically speaking. Right? There are many forms. The one is above the many forms because it governs them and forms them. So at this point, Plotinus can use the metaphor that Plato gave us in the allegory of the cave. The one is like a sun shining on the world of forms, right? Because remember, when the soul gets up out of the cave, out into the light, there's lots and lots of things to see. But the highest thing to see is that sun, which gives visibility to all other things that you see with the mind's eye. So the one is the source of intellectual light. It's what makes all the other forms intelligible. It's the source, therefore, of both the being of the other forms and the intelligibility of the other forms, as light is the source of visibility. And in a sense, the light of the sun is the source of the being of things like trees and grass. You wouldn't have them without the sun shining on the earth. And that means, of course, now a further implication, that for Plotinus, the one is the same thing as what Plato called the good. Remember, in the allegory of the cave, that sun that's shining is labeled the good by Plato. So Plotinus thinks that the one and the good are two labels for this same thing, which is the first principle, the source of all things, and especially the source of intelligible forms. So in summary, we can notice three key features of the one. The one is simple, and this is a technical term meaning not complex, not consisting of parts. Simple the way a geometrical point is simple, right? You can't possibly break it into parts, right? That's a feature of its nobility, of its power, right? It can't be broken apart. It can't become other than itself, the way something becomes other than itself when you cut it up or think of it in parts. The one is, in addition to being simple, above being. This is sometimes translated super essential, where the word essential comes from the word in Latin for being. The one is above being in the sense of being above all those essences or true beings, right? Remember, Plato had identified the forms as true being. Well, the one is above true being, right? So in a sense, the one is not the supreme being. The one is above any supreme being, right? The one is the good above being, and thus it is super essential. Another way of putting it is, to say the one exists or has being is to degrade it. It's beyond that. It transcends that. It doesn't mean that the one doesn't exist, but mere existence is not high enough for it. It's beyond that. But you'll see this will lead to mystical language about the nothing above being, or the darkness above light. In fact, that's a bit of language that's related to the third point about the one. It's simple, it's above being, it's also above knowing or understanding or intellect. Because remember, being and intellect, being and knowing are correlated with one another in Plotinus. So to be above being is also to be above knowing. It's above intellectual vision, above understanding, and therefore it is incomprehensible. That's a kind of technical term in Plotinian theology or philosophy for the one. Right? The one is above all understanding. It is incomprehensible. No intellectual vision will ever grasp it. Right? It's beyond that point. That doesn't mean that we cannot ever get to the one. It means that when we get to the one, we get there by being unified with it rather than by seeing it. In intellectual vision, there still remains a certain amount of duality between knower and known. Even though, according to Plotinus, intellectual vision means that we become one with what we see. Think of how it works in our case. We see an eternal triangle. We grasp it and understand it. For a moment, our minds become one with it. But then we fall back down to our ordinary reality, and we only remember what that real understanding was like. So the identity between mind and form is partial, right? Whereas what needs to happen to grasp the one is absolute unification. We don't actually grasp it. That's a metaphor of grabbing with your hands. No, somehow we become one with it. Now, the secret here for Plotinus is that, in fact, we don't become one so much as we re-become one with the one, because the one is the source of all being. We came forth from the one, like everything else, and we return to it. There's this fundamental movement in Plotinus's universe and in his spirituality from flowing forth, or emanation is the technical term for it, but emanation simply means flowing forth. So there's flowing forth and then returning back. And so when the soul reunites with the one, it's like a homecoming. It's not an ascent to a place it's never been before. It's a going back to its original source. We are, in fact, in some deep sense, always united to the one. We just don't realize it. Right? We couldn't but be united to the one. So when we return to the one, it's not like a new discovery, but a return to what we've always been. It's a little bit like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, discovering that she never really left home. Right? But while we're dreaming in the world of the senses, there's a lot of trouble and pain. There's a journey. There's a lot of work to do. There's battles to fight. But all of it is to get back to where you recognize, I've been home all along. You need that process to get back to where you get home. But the truth is, during all those battles and troubles, all those lusts and losses in this world, you've always been one with the One. You just didn't realize it yet. So that's a keynote in Plotinian spirituality. Plotinus calls this the higher part of the soul, the part of the soul that has never really descended from unity with the One. So now we can summarize. Before we summarize, one more thing. The place of the soul in the universe. We've been talking about the One above the intellect, and the intellect, and then there's a third level in the architecture of Plotinus' universe, the soul. Right? We've been talking about the soul already. Let me briefly mention that just as there is one intellect and many intellects, small I, so also there's one soul and many souls. We each have one of the many souls. We might call them individual souls, but Plotinus would call them divided souls, because the one soul, of course, is the source of the many souls. And in fact, for Plotinus, all souls are fundamentally one, just as all intellects really belong together, united with the one intellect. Right? Manyness is a later phenomenon. Oneness is the original phenomenon. So all intellects flow from the one intellect. All souls flow from the one soul. We are fundamentally one soul, but we feel like we're separated because we pay so much attention to the outside world. So the soul is located ontologically between the intellect and the body. Right? The soul is different from the intellect because it can be embodied. Intellect is fundamentally non-bodily, but the soul can be embodied, it can be involved in this visible and sensible world, therefore it can become ignorant. Right? The intellect can never be ignorant. Our intellects, although they may seem like they're ignorant, never really are. Right? In our dreams we're ignorant. Right? And the soul spends a lot of its time dreaming. But the intellect is always by very nature knowledgeable. It can't be anything else. Right? That's the way intellect is. But the soul, on the other hand, can be ignorant. It can suffer from the mortality of the body that's involved in. It can get impure, right? It can be captured by lust and desire. Right? Intellect can't be like that. Intellect is pure joy, right? That pure, clean, tranquil joy, whereas the soul can get involved in desire for money and sex and power and all those other things. And therefore the soul is vulnerable to suffering. Right? It can be torn apart, in a sense, by being attached to these physical things, which of course can be torn apart. Physical things are the least real and powerful things in the universe because they can get torn apart, destroyed, right? They're mortal, they can get broken apart, and souls are partly attached to those things. So as souls return to the intellect, turn away from bodies, they're ascending, going up, back toward their unity and purity and happiness. They're discovering an original, deep, inward happiness which is part of their very being. Now, you can see that for Plotinus, the architecture of the universe is hierarchical. And here we can summarize now. There's 4 levels. Starting with the lowest, there's bodies. Right? Those things that can be broken apart, smashed, cease to be. Right? Bodies are the only thing in the universe that can cease to be. Therefore, they are the least real things in the universe. Next, there's the soul, right, which can be fragmented and weakened insofar as it's attached to the body, but when it ascends or turns toward the intellect, it's unified, it gains in power and tranquility and joy and knowledge. And then above the soul, there's the intellect itself, that level of pure knowledge, this eternal, uninterrupted contemplation which we participate in when we see eternal forms. And then above that is the level of the One, that perfect unity which is so unified that it can't even be thought of in parts. Now here I can give you a metaphor, an image that Plotinus himself gives to put it all together. It's a fascinating image. Think of the One as a geometrical point, right at the center of the universe, right? Not in space, of course, right? We're not talking literal space here. Space belongs to bodies. We're talking about sort of intellectual space. There's this geometrical point. It's the source of all being, of all light. It's like a sun that is all compacted into a geometrical point, a singularity, the physicists might call it. All right, and then there's the world of the intellect, this realm of intelligible form, all those forms of virtue, mathematical truths, all that stuff, all within one realm, all illuminated by that central sun, that first principle from which all things flow. So imagine all these geometrical forms sort of illuminated by the light of that central point. Then thirdly, imagine the soul, the third level of being. The soul, suppose, is like a crystal ball, a hollow crystal ball, revolving around the intellect as its center. Right? This is actually how people in the ancient world thought that the solar system was. Right? They were crystalline spheres which revolved, and the center of this particular crystalline sphere, and we're speaking metaphorically here, is the intellect. The soul revolves around it. And on the outside, the outer side of this sphere, are a whole bunch of faces. And that's our souls, our individual souls, we'd like to call it. Plotinus would say divided souls, right? We're divided from one another because each of us looks out from our own soul at the external world, and we see the external world from a different side, right? Even the people in the room with me are looking at the desk here from a different angle, and we'll see it differently. And of course, people who are in a different room from me will see entirely different things from me. We're all these faces looking outward into that external world, right? And Plotinus now will be the first person who gives us a meaning to this phrase, the external world. And it's a world of darkness, of death, mortality, right? The only things that can die are things that have bodies. And we're all looking at it from a different perspective, and therefore we think we're different. We think that we are many divided souls, that my soul is not in connection with your soul, that your soul is not in connection with your friend's soul. But that's an illusion, right? We're faced with this mortal world of bodies, the world of darkness, intellectual darkness. But if we could take these faces on the outside of the sphere and turn them around and look into the inside, and this is a key phrase in Plotinus, he uses it all the time, turning into the inside. If we could take these faces and turn them into the inside and look into that intellectual world, we would see that the inner world of all souls is one world. Right? We have an inner self for Plotinus, but that inner self is the divine mind. When we turn into the inside, we turn to the world of intelligible forms, to the world of eternity, to the world of eternal joy. That's our inside. We have a common inside, right? It's not like you have a private inner world and I have a private inner world and they never will meet. Our inner world is one world, the world of the intelligible world, the world of the divine mind. So, you can see that there's a great deal of, shall I say, spiritual power in this notion, in this philosophy of Plotinus. I think of it as a philosophy of pure spirituality, right? A philosophy which takes account of things like our attachment to bodies. Plotinus doesn't say that bodies are awful, it's just that they're not our true identity. And if you're attached to, or like the notion of a deep inner unity that is hidden, that is not part of the world of appearances, then you're going to find something attractive in Plotinus. But I'll suggest this is pure spirituality which is, in many ways, more spiritual than the great religious traditions of the West. Remember how, for Judaism, there's this attachment to the fleshly people of Israel, right? Judaism is something inseparable from this historical identity of this character named Israel in the Old Testament. And in Christianity, there's this attachment to the person of Jesus, this fleshly person who rose from the dead and his body is out of the grave, right? And this attachment to the body of Christ is essential to Christianity. Whereas no such attachment is essential to Plotinus. No attachment to any bodily, historical, visible thing is essential to us. What matters is that inner unity with the divine intellect. In many ways, it seems to me that the deepest affinities in Plotinus's thought are to some things in the Eastern religions, especially Hinduism, where there's a deep inner unity between the soul and the impersonal God. Atman is Brahman is the phrase that summarizes that up. That the deep truth about us is that we are, in our depths, God. But most of the time we spend our time dreaming and thinking we're part of the material world. There's a lot that Plotinus has in common with that Hindu view. But, to sum up again, this pure spirituality is very attractive for any of us who think that the secret to the universe is some deep inner unity that we can find by turning within ourselves, a deep inner unity that's not alien from us but is found in the depths of our being. And if we could only reconnect with the depths of our being, we would find the truth that's behind everything. And that is a legacy that is very, very important for all of Western spirituality.